Geoffrey's bad enough, but I wouldn't want to have been married to Jesus. The lesson this morning was that business in the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus goes off to pray, and the disciples keep falling asleep. He wakes them up and says, "Could you not watch with me but 1 hour? It's my mother." I overslept this morning, flung on my cardigan and got there just as they were standing up. It was Holy Communion, so the militants were out in full force. The sub-zero temperatures in the side chapel, no doubt adding to the attraction. Geoffrey kicks off by apologizing for not defrosting the church. Subdued merriment. Mr. Mendicott, he explains, has shingles, and as was well known, has always failed to initiate us lesser mortals into the mysteries of the boiler. Helpless laughter. Mrs. Belcher read the lesson. Mr. Belcher took round the plate. "Busy day for you," I said to them afterwards. The sermon this morning was about sex. Now, I didn't actually nod off, though I have heard it before. Marriage gives the okay to sex is the gist of it, and while it is far from being the be-all and the end-all, you can say that again, it is the supreme joy of the married state and a symbol of our relationship with God. So, Geoffrey concludes, when we put our money in the plate, it is a symbol of everything in our lives, including our sex. I could only find 10 pence. Now, I was thinking about the sermon during the hymn, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for the deity gifted with all this sex. No fun being made a present of the rare and desiccated conjunctions that take place between Geoffrey and me, or the frightful collisions that presumably still take place between the Belchers. Not to mention the fumblings that go on between Miss Budd and Miss Bantock. It's all right, Alice, if we offer it to God. Well, if you say so, Pauline. Great excitement at the church door afterwards. Geoffrey had announced during the service that after Easter the bishop would be paying us a visit. So the fan club were running around in small circles, Miss Frobisher even going so far as to pinch my elbow. Geoffrey's standing there, the wind billowing out his surplice and ruffling his hair, what the who's who of the Diocese of Ripon call his schoolboy good looks. I helped put away the books, and he did his "underneath this surplice I am but a man like any other" act. "Such a live wire," says Mrs. Belcher, really helping to put the parish on the map. "You're right," burbles Mrs. Shrubsole, looking at me. "We must cherish him." When we got back, I cherished him with some chicken wings in a cream tuna sauce. "Well, that hit the spot," says Jeff. "What?" I said. "The chicken wings. My sermon. I think I really hit the nail on the head." Putting his hand on mine, hoping, I suppose, that having hit one nail on the head, he might hit another. But I said I had to go round with the parish magazine. "Good girl," he said, "then I shall tackle my paperwork instead." Busy day, Sunday afternoon, families taking a runabout, pushing the pram, walking the dog, living. Almighty God, unto whom all hearts be open and from whom no secrets are hid, cleanse the thoughts of our hearts by the inspiration of thy Holy Spirit, that we may worthily magnify thy glorious name, and not spend our Sunday afternoons parked in a lay-by on the ring road, wondering what happened to our life. When I got back, Jeff's just going off to Evensong. Was I coming? When I said no, he said, really? Well then, I suppose I must pretend you've got a headache. Now why? One of the great mysteries of life, one of the great mysteries of my life anyway, is why the vicar's wife has to go to church at all. The barrister's wife doesn't have to go to court. The actor's wife doesn't have to go to every performance. So why do I always have to be on parade? Not to mention the larger question, of course, of whether one actually believes in God. Well, it's assumed, being the vicar's wife, that one does. But the questions never come up. Well, not between Geoffrey and me anyway. And I can see why. To look at me, the hair, the flat chest, the wan smile, you'd think I was cut out for God. Maybe I am, but I'd just like to have been asked, that's all. Not that it really matters. As long as one can run a tight jumble sale, one can believe what one likes. It may be that Geoffrey doesn't believe in God either. I've always wanted to ask him. Geoffrey, I'd say, yes, Susan, do you honestly believe in God? I mean, cards on the table, you don't, do you? God's just a job like any other. You have to bring home the bacon somehow. But no, not a word. The issue's never discussed. After he'd gone, I discovered we were without sherry, so I've just been round to the off-licence. The woman served me. Didn't smile. Can't think why. I spend enough. We were talking about the ordination of women. The bishop asked me what I thought. Should women take the services? So long as it doesn't have to be me, I wanted to say. It could be taken by a trained gorilla. Oh, yes, Jeff chips in. Susan's all in favour. She's keener than I am, aren't you, darling? More sprouts, anyone, I said. He's on the young side for a bishop. But then he's been a prominent sportsman at the university, so that would explain it. Boxing or rugby or something. Broken nose at some point, anyway. Hobbies, bricklaying, apparently. Refers to me throughout as Mrs. Vicar. Says he wants beer for lunch, so Geoffrey says he'll join him, which leaves me with the communion wine. Geoffrey's all over him because the rumours out he's up shopping around for a new archdeacon. Asks Jeff how outgoing I am. Actually says that. How outgoing is Mrs. Vicar? Mr. Vicar jumps in with a short list of my accomplishments and a rundown of my punishing schedule. I start off by changing the wheel on the Fiesta and then hasten off to the bedside of a dying parishioner, apparently, after which, having done the altar flowers and dispensed warmth and appreciation to sundry parishioners, I top off a thrill-packed morning by taking round Meals on Wheels. Somehow, and this to me is a miracle, says Jeff, somehow managing to rustle up a delicious lunch in the interim. The miracle of which is somewhat belied by the rather flabby lasagna we are currently embarked on. Ah, the ladies, says the bishop, where would we be without them? Disaster strikes as I'm doling out the tinned peaches. The jug into which I've decanted the carnation milk gets knocked over, probably by me. Jeff, for whom turning the other cheek is part of the job, claims he knocked it with his elbow, and the bishop takes the same line, insisting that he gets doused in carnation milk practically every day of his life. Still, when I get a cloth to wipe off his shoes, I catch him giving me a funny look. It's Mary Magdalene and the Nivea cream all over again. After lunch, Jeff is supposed to be taking him on a tour of the parish, but while we're having our cup of instant, he claps his hand to his forehead and suddenly remembers he's got to be in Cayley blessing a steam engine. After he had gone and we're stacking the dishwasher, I asked Jeff how he thinks it's gone. Doesn't know. Fingers crossed, I said. Well, I think there's something more constructive than that we could do, he says, rather crisply, and goes off to mend his bicycle inner tube. I sit by the Aga. As I'm dozing off, I think that by something more constructive, perhaps he means prayer. When I wake up, there's a note from Jeff saying, "Gone to talk to the ladies bright hour, go to bed." I'm not tired. And anyway, I've just discovered we're almost out of sherry, so I go into Leeds. Oh, I don't go round the corner anymore. I owe them a bit on the side. Besides, she's always so surly. There's a little Indian shop behind the infirmary I discovered. It's a newsagent's, really, but it sells drink and practically everything else the way they do. Open last thing at night, Sundays included, my ideal. Ramesh is his name. I call him Mr. Ramesh, though Ramesh may be his Christian name. Only not Christian, of course. I've been there once or twice before, but this time he takes me into the back place and sits me on a sack of something or other and talks. Little statuette of a god on the wall. A god, not the god, not the definite article. There are thousands of them, apparently. Safety in numbers, I say, only he doesn't understand. Looks a lot more fun than Jesus anyway. Shows me pictures of other gods getting up to all sorts. Well, she's a very busy lady, I said. Is that yoga? Well, it helps, he said. It's very athletic, apparently. Married, although his wife's only about 14, so they won't let her in. He calls me Mrs. Vicar too. Only it's different somehow. He has lovely teeth. Once upon a time, I thought I had my whole life planned out. Well, part of it anyway. I wasn't very clear about the first part. But at the stroke of 50, I was all set to become a wonderful woman. The wife of a country doctor or a local architect. A wise, witty and ultimately white-haired old woman who always stood on her own 2 feet until one day, at the age of 80, she was coming out of the county library and she fell under the weight of her self-improving book, broke her hip, died peacefully, contentedly, without fuss, under a snowy coverlet at the cottage hospital. And coming away from the funeral afterwards, in a lovely country cemetery, on a bright winter's afternoon, people would say, well, she was a wonderful woman. Now, had I been serious about this ambition, I should have seen to it that I was equipped with the skills necessary to its achievement. How to make jam, which upon reaching a good rolling boil successfully coats the spoon. How to whip up a victorious sponge that just gives to the fingertip. How to plan, execute, and successfully carry out a garden pet. All weapons in the armory of every outstanding Anglican lady. I can do none of these things. I'm even a fool at flower arranging. You'd think I could have a PhD on the subject with all the bloody classes I've been to, but no. My efforts show no more evidence of art than walking sticks in an umbrella stand. It's temperament, really. I just don't have it. When you think squash is a competitive activity, try flower arranging. On this particular day, the rota had Miss Frobisher and Mrs. Belcher down for the side aisles, and I was paired with Mrs. Shrubsole for the altar and the lectern. My honest opinion, needless to say unvoiced, is that if they were sincere about their religion, they would dispense with flower arranging altogether and invest in some of those permanent plastic jobs, and put the money between the current most popular famine. However, round mid-morning, I go over to the church with a handful of dog-eared chrysanthemums. Look like they could use with an immediate drink, so I call into the vestry and root out a vase or two in the cupboard where Geoffrey keeps his communion wine. Not looming very large on my horizon, I assume that I am doing the altar. But when I come out of the vestry, Mrs. Shrubsole is at the altar, well embarked on her flower arranging. I thought I was doing the altar, I said. No, I think Mrs. Belcher will bear me out, she said. I'm down for the altar, you're down for the lectern. Why? She said, smiling sweetly at me. Do you have a preference? The only preference I have is to shove my chrysanthemums up her nose. But I practice a bit of Christian forbearance and go and stick my chrysanthemums in a vase by the lectern. In the best traditions of my flower arranging, they look more like the poles of a wigwam. So I go over to see if I can cadge a bit of backing from Mrs. Belcher. Are you using this? I said, picking up a piece of mouldy old fern. I most certainly am, she said. I can use every bit of my spirea, it gives it backing. So I wander over to Miss Frobisher to see if she has a bit of greenery going, begging, only she's doing a Japanese number, a vase in the shape of a test tube, half filled with gravel, into which she's throttling a lone carnation. So I retire to the vestry to calm my shattered nerves. And when I come out, ready to tackle my chrysanthemums again, Mrs. Shrubsole has apparently finished and has fetched over the other two to the altar to admire her handiwork. So I wander over to take a look. Well, it's a brown job. Beech leaves, teasels, grass, that school of thought. Mrs. Shrubsole is saying, I call it forest murmurs. It's what I did for my highly commendable at Harrogate last year. What do you think? Well, Gert and Daisy are, of course, speechless with admiration. But when I tentatively suggest that it might look a bit better if she picked up all the bits and pieces lying around, she said, what bits and pieces? Well, I said the fir cones and the acorns and whatnot, and what's this conifer in aid of? Leave that, she said. My whole arrangement pivots on that. Pivots, I said. When the adjudicator was commenting on my arrangement, he particularly singled out the hint I gave of the forest floor. "Mrs. Shrubsole," I said, "this is the altar of St. Michael's and all angels. It is not the wind and the willows." "I think we ought to sit down," said Mrs. Belcher. "I don't want to sit down," I said. "I said it is all very well to transform the altar into something out of Bambi, but let us not forget that for the vicar, the altar is his working surface. Moreover, should he happen to sink to his knees in a bit of prayer, which, as this is the altar he is wont to do, he is very likely to get one of these teasel thingies in his eye. This is not a flower arrangement, it's a booby trap, a health hazard. In fact," I said, in a moment of supreme inspiration, "it ought to be labelled has floor. Permit me to demonstrate." And I start to get down on my knees to prove how bloody lethal her forest murmurs is, only, well, I must trip, because the next thing I know I'm rolling down the altar steps and end up banging my forehead on the communion rail. Well, Mrs. Shrubsole, who, along with every other organisation known to man, is a member of the St. John's Ambulance Brigade, wants me left lying down. Mrs. Belcher, on the other hand, is all for getting me up in a chair. Leave them lying down, Muriel, and they're very likely to inhale their own vomit. It happens all the time. Only, says Mrs. Shrubsole, not wanting to concede anything to Mrs. Belcher, if they vomited. She hasn't vomited. No, I said, but I shall at any moment if I have to listen to any more of this drivel, and I start to get up. "Oh, look at that," she says, Mrs. Belcher. "Look at that. Is that blood?" pointing to my forehead. Mrs. Shrubsole says, "Well, it could be, I suppose," not wanting to concede anything of a medical nature to Mrs. B. "But what she needs is some hot, sweet tea. I thought that theory had been discredited," said Mrs. Belcher. "Well, discredited or not, it's enough to send Miss Frobisher streaking off in search of a tea bag. And it subsequently transpires, telephoning all and sundry in search of Geoffrey. He's in York, attending one of those interdenominational conferences on the role of the church in the hitherto uncolonized department of life. Underfloor central heating, probably. Well, he comes harrying back, thinking I'm at death's door, and on finding that I'm not, he has nothing more constructive to add than that I should take a nap. Well, this gives the fan club the green light to invade the rectory, and to make endless tea, and the vicar his lunch, which, as he puts it, spoiled him rotten. And since it also gives them license to conduct a fact-finding survey of the housekeeping arrangements, or lack thereof, a good time is had by all. Meanwhile, Emily Bronte is stretched on the sofa in a light doze. When I wake up, I can hear Geoffrey calling, "Mrs. Shrubsole is going, darling." I don't get up. I don't even open my eyes. I just wave and say, "Goodbye, Mrs. Shrubsole." Only, as I'm drifting off again, I think maybe I said, "Goodbye, Mrs. Subsoil." Doesn't matter, really, because I meant the other, Mrs. Shrubsoil. When I wake up, it's dark, and Geoffrey's gone out. Can't find a thing in the cupboards to eat, so I get the car out and go into Leeds. I sit in the shop for a while, don't say much, but then I feel a bit wanny, so Mr. Ramesh lets me go into the back place to lie down on the sacks. I must have dozed off, because when I wake up, He's come into the room and has started taking his clothes off. "What are you doing?" I said. "What about the shop?" He said, "Don't worry about the shop. I've closed the shop." I said, "It's only 9 o'clock. You don't close till 11. He said, "I do tonight." I said, "What's tonight?" He said, "A chance in a million. Will you take your clothes off, please?" And I did. You never see pictures of Jesus smiling, do you? I mentioned this to Geoffrey once. "Good point, Susan," is what he said, so I wished I'd never brought it up in the first place. Said I should think of our Lord as having an inward smile. The gospel, according to Geoffrey, being that as Jesus was made man, he smiled, laughed, and did everything just like the rest of us. "Do you think he smirked?" I asked, whereupon Geoffrey suddenly remembered that he had to be burying somebody in about 5 minutes, and he took himself off. I was sitting in church yesterday, before the service, wrestling with this point of theology, when it suddenly occurred to me that something must have happened to Geoffrey. I mean, the service ought to have kicked off ages before, and he's still in the vestry. Mr. Bland is filling in on the organ with something uplifting. Miss Frobisher, never one to lose an opportunity, has slumped to her knees for a spot of unscheduled silent prayer. Mrs. Belcher is lost in thought and contemplation of the altar, still adorned with forest murmurs, a trail of ivy round the cross, the final bit of inspiration. Mr. Bland ups the volume, but still no sign of Geoffrey. "Arnold," said Mrs. Belcher, "there appears to be a hiatus in the proceedings," and suddenly the fan club is on red alert. She's just leveraging poor old Arnie to his feet when I get up first and nip in there to investigate. His Reverence is there, white-faced, every cupboard door open, and practically in tears. "Have you seen it?" he said. "Seen what?" I said. "The wine, the communion wine. Somebody's taken it." "Well, that's no tragedy," I said, and offered to pop out and get some ordinary. "Well, they're closed," he said. "And besides, what would it look like?" Well, I said it would look like we'd run out of communion wine. "We haven't run out," he hissed. "There was a full bottle here on Friday. Somebody's taken it." Well, it was on the tip of my tongue to say that if Jesus was all he was cracked up to be, why didn't he just use some ordinary water and put it to the test? When suddenly I remembered that Mr. Bland kept a bottle of cough mixture in his cupboard, in case one of the choir boys got chesty. Well, at the thought of celebrating our Lord's Supper in Benelin, Geoffrey now has a complete nervous breakdown. But, as I point out, it's red and it's sweet, and nobody's going to notice, nor do they. I do see Mr. Belcher licking his lips somewhat thoughtfully as he walks back up the aisle. "What was the delay?" says Mrs. Shrubsole. "Oh, nothing," I said. "Just a little hiccup." Well, having got it right for once, I was feeling rather pleased with myself. Only Geoffrey apparently wasn't, because he never said a word all afternoon. So I bunked off Evensong and went into Leeds. Mr. Ramesh was obviously expecting me, because there was a bed made up on the sacks in the storeroom upstairs. So I went up first and got in. And when I'm in bed, I can put out my hand and feel the lentils running through my fingers. When he came up, he was dressed in his proper clothes, a long white shirt, sash, and what not, loincloth underneath, all spotless like Jesus, only not. As I watched him undress, I thought about them all at evensong. Geoffrey praying in that palsy way he does, giving you time to mean each phrase, and the fan clubs lapping it up, thinking they're loving God when they're just loving Geoffrey. Lighten our darkness, we beseech thee, O Lord, and by thy infinite and great mercies defend us from the perils and dangers of this night. Like Mr. Ramesh, age 26, with wonderful legs, who goes swimming every morning at the Marion Street Baths and plays hockey for Horsford. I asked him if they offered their sex to God too, only he wasn't very interested in the point. But then, as far as I can tell, sex is all part of their gods anyway. And I can understand why. It's the first time I've understood what all the fuss is about. There, among the lentils, on the second Sunday after Trinity. I just popped into the vestry. He's put a lock on the cupboard door. I stand up and say, my name is Susan and I'm a vicar's wife, and I am an alcoholic. And then I tell my story, or part of it anyway. Don't pull any punches, says Clem, my counsellor. Nobody's going to be shocked. Believe me, love, we've all been there. But I don't tell them about Mr. Ramesh because they've not been there. Listen, people, I'd say, I was so drunk I used to go and sleep with an Asian grocer. Yes, and you won't believe it, but I loved it. Loved every moment of it. Dear, dear, they'd say, this was a real drunken lady. So I put a veil over Mr. Ramesh, who once at the feast of St. Stephen and St. Jude put bells around his ankles and makeup on his eyes and naked except for his little belt, danced in the back room of a shop with a tambourine. How did you come to AA, they asked me. My husband, I said. The vicar, he persuaded me to come, but I lied. It wasn't my husband. It was Mr. Ramesh, that exquisitely delicate and polite Mr. Ramesh, who one Sunday afternoon turned his troubled face towards me and asked if he might take the bull by the horns and inquire as to whether intoxication was a prerequisite for sexual intercourse. Or was it only when I went to bed with him, the beautiful Mr. Ramesh, age 26, with wonderful legs? Was it only with him that I had to be inebriated? And was it, said this slim, flawless, and troubled creature, was it perhaps because of his colour? Because if not, it liked to float the suggestion that being sober might be even nicer. So the credit for the road to Damascus goes to Mr. Ramesh, whose first name turns out to be Ramesh too. Ramesh, Ramesh, a member of the Community Council and the Leeds Federation of Trade. But none of this I say. In fact, I say nothing at all. Only, when it becomes clear to Geoffrey, and it takes all of 3 weeks, that Mrs. Vickett is finally on the wagon, who is it gets the credit? One of Mr. Ramesh's jolly little gods, too busy doing everything under the sun to one another. Oh no, it's full marks to Geoffrey's chum, the deity, moving in his well-known mysterious ways. So, now everything has changed. For the moment I am a new woman and Geoffrey is a new man. He brings it up on the slightest pretext. My wife is an alcoholic, you know. Oh, yes, it's been a great challenge for me and for the parish's extended family. From a fly in the ointment, I've been transformed into a feather in his cap. Included it in his sermon on Prayers Answered, in which he revealed that he and the fan club have been having these jolly little get-togethers for quite some time, in which they prayed all over my problem, as they call it. Practically sent me racing back to the Tea of Peppy just to think of it. The fans, never believing that their prayers would be answered, are furious, of course. They think it's brought Geoffrey and me closer together. Geoffrey thinks that too. We were at one of those doleful diocesan jamborees last week, and as I'm standing there clutching my grapefruit juice, Geoffrey's telling the tale to some bearded cleric. Suddenly he seizes my hand. We met it with love, he cries, as if love is some all-purpose antibiotic, which for Geoffrey it probably is. And it goes on from there, the mileage in it endless. Foolishly I told Geoffrey that when I stand up at AA, I sometimes tell the story of their flower arranging. Result, he's now telling it all over the diocese. First time was at a conference on the supported parish. Gales of deep, liberating, caring laughter. He's put a new twist on it now. Now he tells it as if he's speaking about a parishioner. But then at the end he says, friends, I must tell you something. Deep hush. That drunken flower arranger was my wife. Silence. Then the applause. Terrific. I caught some of the other upwardly mobile young parsons sneaking a look at me now and then, and you can tell that they're thinking, why wasn't I smart enough to have married an alcoholic, or even better, a drug addict, a problem like who I could work a little redemption number on right here at my own doorstep. Because there's no stopping Geoffrey now. He grips my hand in public. Nay, brandishes it. We're a team, he cries. He's certain to be made rural dean, and that's just the beginning. As the bishop says, he's just the sort of man we're looking for on the bench. Someone with seasoned compassion. Someone who's looked life in the face. Someone who's been there. Mr. Ramesh has sold his shop now. He's gone back to India to fetch his wife. She's old enough now, apparently. I went there on Sunday. There was a boy writing under new management on the window, spelled wrong, and underneath something written in Hindi, spelled right probably. He said that he thought that Mr. Ramesh would be opening another shop, only in Preston this time. They do that, you know, Asians. Build something up, get it going nicely, then take the profit and move on. It's a good thing, really. We should be more like that, more enterprising. My group meets twice a week, and I go religiously. Well, and that's what it is, of course. Only the names are different. Frankie and Steve, Susie and Clem. But it's Miss Frobisher and Mrs. Shrubswell all over again. Never liked going to one church, and I end up going to two. Geoffrey would call it the mysterious ways of God, but I would call it bad taste, and I wouldn't do it to a dog. But that's something nobody ever says about God. He has no taste at all.